You remember the sound, that deep mechanical clack every time your fingers hit the keys, that low, steady hum coming from inside the box, like the machine was breathing, like it was alive. You sat down at that computer, and it felt like you were sitting behind the wheel of something serious, something that meant business. Now, I want you to think about what you paid for your last laptop. Maybe $1,200, maybe $1,500, maybe more. And I want you to ask yourself, how long did it last before it started slowing down? Before the updates started appearing every week? Before it started nagging you to upgrade to something newer, something you didn't ask for, something you didn't need? 3 years? Maybe 4 if you were lucky? Here is what nobody in Silicon Valley wants you to say out loud. The computers you used in the 1980s were built better than the ones they're selling you today. Not because the technology was better, but because the intention was different. Back then, the goal was to build something that worked, something you owned, something that lasted. Today, the goal is to build something that makes you come back and buy another one. And today, on Behind the Tech, we are going to follow the exact trail, the exact moment when the industry stopped building machines to last and started building machines to expire. Because what happened to the golden age of computing isn't just a technology story. It's a story about greed, about control, about a calculated decision made in a boardroom somewhere, a decision that transferred billions of dollars out of your pocket and into theirs. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to see the machine in a completely different way. Let's go back, all the way back to 1981. IBM releases the personal computer, the IBM 5150, and something remarkable happens. Ordinary people start buying computers for their homes, not just corporations, not just universities, regular Americans. And what did those machines give them? They gave them ownership. When you bought a Commodore 64, you owned a Commodore 64. When you bought Lotus 123 in that cardboard box, with the physical floppy disks and the fat printed manual, you owned Lotus 123 forever. No subscription, no renewal, no expiration date. You installed it once. It worked. And 20 years later, it still worked. Now, let's talk about the keyboard for a moment, because this is important. The IBM Model M keyboard, introduced in 1984, was built with what's called a buckling spring mechanism. Every key had its own physical spring inside it. When you pressed a key, you felt it. You heard it. Typists loved it because there was no ambiguity. You knew when the keystroke registered. You knew when the command went through. And here is something almost unbelievable. Some of those Model M keyboards are still in use today. Not in a museum, in offices, on desks, plugged into modern computers, 40 years old, and they still work perfectly. Can you name a single piece of technology you bought in the last 10 years that you expect to still be using in 2045? Take a moment with that question. And it wasn't just the keyboard. The early IBM ThinkPad laptops, before Lenovo bought the brand, were subjected to what IBM called the HALT protocol. Highly accelerated life testing. They dropped these machines. They froze them. They blasted them with vibration. They ran them for thousands of hours at extreme temperatures. Some of those ThinkPad models actually flew on NASA space shuttle missions, not because NASA had a sponsorship deal, but because the machines were reliable enough to trust in space. Think about what that means. The same machine you could buy at your local computer store, the same one your neighbor had at home. That machine was considered reliable enough to orbit the Earth at 17,500 miles per hour. Now, here is the question I want to plant in your mind before we move forward, because we're going to come back to this. If they could build machines that reliable in 1985 with a fraction of today's technology, budget, and manufacturing capability, why can't they build machines that last today? The answer isn't that they can't. The answer is that they won't, and the reason they won't is something we need to talk about, something that changed everything. Something that happened in a very specific window of time, somewhere between the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when someone, somewhere, ran the numbers and made a very cold decision. We'll get to exactly what that decision was. But first, there's something you need to understand about how that golden era actually ended. Here is the central problem with building something to last. If it lasts forever, you only sell it once. Think about it from a pure business standpoint. If IBM sells you a computer in 1985 and that computer works perfectly until the year 2000, IBM made one sale. One transaction, 15 years of reliability translated directly into 15 years of no revenue from you. Wall Street doesn't reward that. Wall Street rewards growth. Consistent, predictable, year-over-year growth. And you cannot show Wall Street consistent growth if your product is so good that people never need to replace it. So the industry made a pivot, a very deliberate, very calculated pivot. The first move was to stop selling software as a product and start selling it as a service. Instead of paying once and owning forever, you would now pay every single month. Forever. Microsoft Office used to come in a box. You paid for it once, you owned it. Today, Microsoft 365 costs you an annual subscription. And if you stop paying, your access stops. The files you created in their format on their platform become inaccessible. You went from owning a tool to renting access to your own work, but the subscription model was only half the strategy. The other half was making sure the hardware itself couldn't keep up. In 2021, Microsoft announced Windows 11, new operating system. Reasonable, right? Except here's the part they buried in the technical fine print. Windows 11 required something called a TPM 2.0 chip, a trusted platform module that older machines simply didn't have. Not because those machines were slow, not because they couldn't run the software, but because they lacked one specific hardware component that Microsoft decided, somewhat arbitrarily, was now mandatory. The result? Hundreds of millions of perfectly functional computers, machines running smoothly, doing exactly what they were designed to do, were effectively declared obsolete overnight. Not because they stopped working, but because Microsoft drew a line in the sand and said, "This machine is no longer one of ours." The United Nations estimated that in 2022 alone, the world generated 62 million metric tons of electronic waste. 62 million metric tons. Much of that waste, circuit boards, screens, batteries, casings, will take hundreds of years to break down. And a significant portion of it is hardware that still works, but there is no subscription revenue in a machine that still works. Apple has its own version of this story. For years, and I mean years, Apple sold laptops with batteries that were glued and soldered directly into the chassis. Not screwed in, not snapped in. Glued, meaning when the battery degraded, and all batteries degrade, you couldn't simply replace it yourself. You had to bring it to an Apple store. You had to pay Apple's price. You had to wait however long they decided. And if the repair cost was too high, well, Apple would be happy to show you their newest model. Compare that to the machines from your era. The back of an IBM PC was held together with standard screws. You could open it with any screwdriver. The RAM was a clip-in module. The hard drive had a standard connector. If something broke, you replaced that part, not the whole machine. The philosophy of repair was built into the design. That philosophy didn't die because technology advanced. It died because repair is the enemy of repurchase. Now, here's what I want you to hold on to as we move into the final part of this story. This shift didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen because engineers suddenly forgot how to build durable things. It happened because a generation of executives looked at the hardware business and decided that the old model, build it well, sell it once, was leaving money on the table. And they were right. It was leaving money on the table. Your money. The question is, what do you do about it? Let me tell you something about the generation that grew up with those machines. You learned technology the hard way, which means you learned it the right way. You read the manuals. You upgraded your own RAM. You called the tech support line and actually understood what they were telling you to do. You didn't need a 22-year-old in a blue t-shirt to explain your own computer to you, and that experience gave you something that most people today completely lack: a baseline. You know what a well-built machine feels like. You know what genuine ownership feels like. You know the difference between a tool that serves you and a subscription that extracts from you. That knowledge is not nothing. That knowledge is actually a form of power. So what does that power look like in practice? It looks like this. The refurbished business laptop market has exploded. And the reason is that older commercial-grade hardware, the kind built before the era of planned obsolescence fully took hold, is still genuinely superior to a lot of what's being sold today. A 5-year-old refurbished ThinkPad with more RAM and an upgraded SSD will outperform a brand new budget consumer laptop in almost every real-world task, and it will cost you a fraction of the price. There's also the question of software. When Microsoft announced that Windows 10 would reach end-of-life support in October 2025, millions of machines were suddenly going to be left behind again. The same playbook, the same pressure to upgrade. But here's what they don't advertise. Linux, a free open-source operating system, runs beautifully on older hardware. Distributions like Linux Mint are specifically designed to be accessible for people who aren't software engineers. Fast, secure, no forced updates, no subscriptions, no telemetry harvesting your usage data. It's not for everyone, but it exists, and it's free, and it gives you back something the industry spent 30 years trying to take away from you. Control. There's also a legal fight happening right now that deserves your attention. The right to repair movement. The basic argument is simple. When you buy a product, you should have the legal right to repair it yourself or take it to whoever you choose, not just to the manufacturer's authorized service center. Several states have passed or are considering right to repair legislation, and the tech industry, particularly Apple, has spent millions lobbying against it. Because again, repair is the enemy of repurchase. Here's the thing about this moment in history. For the first time in decades, the conversation is shifting. People, real people, not just engineers, are starting to ask why a 3-year-old device should be unsupported. They're starting to ask why they can't replace a battery without paying $500. They're starting to ask whether a subscription to use software they used to own actually makes any sense. These are your questions, the ones your generation has been asking for 20 years. The rest of the world is finally catching up. The machines from your era weren't just built better. They were built with a different philosophy. That the person who bought the machine was the one in charge of it. That the relationship between you and your technology was one of ownership, not subscription. Of control, not dependency. That philosophy didn't become obsolete because it was wrong. It was abandoned because it was inconvenient for the people running the balance sheets. But you already knew that. You knew it the first time a Windows update restarted your computer in the middle of something important without asking your permission. You knew it the first time a device you paid for started showing you ads. You knew it the first time a perfectly good machine was declared incompatible, not because it stopped working, but because a corporation decided its useful life was over. The technology industry has tried very hard to make you feel like your instincts are outdated, like your preference for durability and ownership is just nostalgia. Like you just don't understand how the modern world works. Don't believe it. The instinct to own what you pay for is not nostalgia. It's just common sense. And common sense, as it turns out, is something they cannot engineer out of you. So let's bring this together, because this story deserves a verdict. The golden age of personal computing The era of the IBM PC, the Commodore 64, the original ThinkPad, produced machines that were genuinely built to last. Not because the engineers were more talented, and not because the technology was more advanced, but because the business model rewarded durability. You built a reputation by building something good. That era ended not with a technological failure, but with a financial calculation. Somewhere between the late 1990s and the early 2010s, the industry made a collective decision that recurring revenue was more valuable than customer loyalty, that subscriptions were more profitable than one-time sales, that a machine designed to last 15 years was, from a business perspective, a 15-year mistake. And so they engineered obsolescence into the product. Not all at once. Not in ways that were easy to see at first. Gradually. Through software updates that slowed down older hardware. Through batteries that couldn't be replaced. Through arbitrary hardware requirements that excluded perfectly functional machines. Through ecosystems designed to make you dependent and switching costs designed to make leaving expensive. The result is a technology landscape where the average consumer replaces their laptop every 3 to 4 years, where the global e-waste mountain grows by millions of tons annually, where software you used to own now lives on a server somewhere, and your access to it ends the moment you stop paying. This is not progress. This is extraction. But here is where the verdict gets more complicated and more hopeful. The pushback is real. The right to repair movement has won legislative victories. Open source software continues to mature. The refurbished hardware market is growing. And perhaps most importantly, the conversation is shifting. People are asking different questions now. Not just what does it do, but how long will it last? Not just what can I subscribe to, but what can I actually own? The industry spent decades trying to convince you that the way things work now is the only way they could ever work. But you've seen the alternative, you lived it, you used it, you typed on it, and the evidence is still out there, in garages, in attics, in repair shops, still running, still clacking away, still proving the point. What you need right now is what you needed back then. Information, independence, and the confidence to trust your own judgment. This channel exists to give you that. So I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me the first computer you ever owned and how long it lasted. Because I have a feeling the answers are going to say everything about which era built things right. And if you believe that technology should still be built to last, that ownership should mean something, that durability is not a marketing gimmick, then this channel belongs to you. Hit subscribe and stay with us. Next time on I'm Behind the Tech, we're going after a story that connects directly to everything we talked about today. You know how we said the goal was to make you dependent? Well, it turns out the smartphone was the masterpiece of that strategy, and the man who designed it knew exactly what he was doing. That story's next. You're not going to want to miss it.